10th of December. Sam stopped at the cash point on his way into work. There was a queue. No problem, he thought to himself, full of goodwill. I can wait in line even on a cold December morning. It had been an excellent weekend, fortified by a good Sunday lunch. Sam felt kind of rekindled inside and, for once, wide awake on a Monday morning. There were 4 people in the queue. Everyone had headphones on. Sam's iPod was tuned to his mellow Monday jazz mix. The first person in line was very quick, £20 for the week at work. The second and third took longer. Each one checked their balance. Shoulders sagged and faces fell. Number 3 even looked right and left, questions on her face. Each then withdrew what looked like a lot of money, stuffed it in their wallet and went on their way. Number 4 was an attractive young woman in her early 20s. Sam could see over her shoulder. She checked behind her before punching in the pin and looked fiercely at Sam. He studied the back of her rather nicely knee-length boots. Then she checked her balance. £250 overdrawn. Bother, Sam heard her say, even through the iPod. It's only the 10th of December. Instead of money, the machine spat out one of those annoying white slips. Maxed out, said Sam. Know the feeling. He removed one earphone as a friendly gesture. Clear off, said the woman. What's it to you, stupid prat? Chastened, Sam turned round to the watching queue behind him and smiled weakly as he replaced his earpiece. They were all suddenly looking in different directions. 2 of them were checking their watches. Without knowing exactly why, Sam took £10 less out of the machine than he intended and escaped. He switched off the iPod to give himself space to think. But first, the silence was extraordinary. He tried to see the high street for the first time, like one of the worlds in the calendar. Most of the shops were not open yet, but each window was already a blaze of light in the cold morning mist. There were 100 special Christmas offers in as many yards. Many advertised low prices and free credit. Unmissable deal. Buy now, pay later. Give your family the Christmas they deserve. The experience of a lifetime. Pamper yourself this Christmas. You know you want to. The banks, Sam noticed, were the same as the shops, brightly lit and covered in trees and tinsel. Interest-free credit, sir? No problem. New cards? Suit you, sir. A loan for the turkey? Let me gift wrap it for you. Sam's mind went back to the junk mail by the front door. Every other day it seemed there was a letter inviting him to borrow more. Strange, really, Sam thought, turning into the office. Never noticed it much before. Must be getting worse. He waved a cheery good morning to Richard through the open door of his office. He growled something back. Sam hung up his jacket and booted up his computer. The first email was a circular from Richard. Something about punctuality, working hard, and no frivolous talk in the office. Apparently intended to stroll around the floor between the cubicles at irregular intervals. Stamping out the culture of time wasting was a phrase from the memo. He's been on another management course, sighed Sam wearily. Tizzy came in looking stunning and breathless as usual. She waved very cautiously through the partition. How was the weekend? She mouthed. Sam's eyes signaled that Richard was on patrol. He gave her the thumbs up. Good, he mouthed back. Yours? He pointed. Tizzy's thumb turned down and she pulled a face. Disaster. Sam made what he thought was a sympathetic face. Actually, it looked more like he'd swallowed a hairball. Coffee at 11, he mouthed, pointing to an empty cup and holding up 2 fingers. You're on. Tizzy looked a bit more cheerful as she hung up her coat and hat. The routine was well rehearsed. Tizzy and Sam left the office separately at 2-minute intervals, clutching a file of papers. Sam had already checked Richard's online diary and discovered he was upstairs in a meeting from 10:30 until lunchtime. Perfect. The rendezvous was a Starbucks across the street. By the time Sam arrived, Tizzy had the coffees and had grabbed a table well away from the window. "Oh, I needed this," she said. "What a weekend." Sam didn't need to ask. He knew she was spending it with her parents in the country and taking the latest in a long line of boyfriends. "How did they like Gary?" he asked. "Absolutely loved him. That was the problem, darling. Mum dropped all kinds of hints. You know the kind of thing. Big sister's weddings, photos left all over the place, drove past the local church on the way to the pub for lunch. Lots of hints about not getting any younger." Did he get the message? Rather too well. He was absolutely silent all the way home. We had a furious row when we got back to my place. He dumped me without ceremony, collected his things and left. That's it. How many is that this year? 13. Catching them is not a problem. Keeping them is a disaster. How about you? You were as grumpy as hell on Friday. What happened with Josie? It was good, I think, Sam said. Sorry about the bad mood. It was all getting a bit much last week. I hate December. Me too, said Tizzy, leaning across the table. But there's always the Christmas party to look forward to. Sam smiled weakly for the second time that morning. He was searching for the right reply when out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of Germaine from the office looking for a seat. Germaine, hi, over here. For once, Tizzy didn't look too pleased, but she moved over to make some space for a huge mocha with whipped cream, an enormous slice of chocolate cake, and Germaine, who just managed to squeeze himself in between the table and the chair. Don't normally see you in here, mate, said Sam. I thought you were looking for that promotion. To Sam's utter and lasting discomfort, Germaine sniffed and looked as though he might burst into tears. It's not going to happen, he said. They'll give it to someone whose face fits better. He took a slurp of his mocha and left a long white moustache along his upper lip. Tizzy offered him a tissue. Germaine blew his nose, heads turned. The moustache was largely untouched. It's not the problem anyway. What's up then, old man, said Sam. Wife and kids okay? He knew there were at least 3 little Germaines at home, maybe more. Tizzy offered another tissue. Germaine blew again, and this time he wiped his eyes. It's Christmas, he said. We just can't afford it. Can't afford it, said Sam. What do you mean? We're still paying for the last one, Germaine said. Things were really hard last year. The kids all wanted such expensive stuff. We just bought it on credit. It seemed really easy at the time. Then Lisa gave up work looking for number 4. The washing machine broke down. They all want deer stuff again this year. They nag me every time we go shopping or watch TV. Weekends are hell. These letters come from the bank most days about the overdraft and repayments. What am I supposed to do? I'm not sure I can even go on. Sam absent-mindedly took a bite of chocolate cake and wondered what to say. Tizzy put a hand on his shoulder. Just then, Germaine's phone rang. He listened for a moment, protecting the chocolate cake with his enormous hand. It's Maureen in reception, he said. Top floor meeting has just finished. Richard's on his way downstairs. Scramble. Sam was back at his desk just as Richard came back into the office. Tizzy arrived a moment later, papers under her arm, looking as though she had just visited the photocopier. She flashed Richard her most winning smile. His eyes turned to follow her down the corridor. While he was distracted, Germaine crept behind him, clutching the remains of the mocha, and squeezed back into his cubicle. Thanks for listening, guys, he emailed later. Sam thought hard about Germaine's situation all the rest of the day and all the way back home. What was the point of Christmas if it was just a time for people like Germain to get deeper into debt? Sam found it hard enough to balance the books just for himself. Germain had to provide for 6 on a smaller wage. The bright lights and the advertising for credit took on a more sinister tinge in the evening light. The text message arrived just as Sam got home. Megs was on her way out. She'd agreed to meet Josie to go swimming once a week. Alice was waiting impatiently by the calendar. Just got it, said Sam. Honest? I know, said Alice. The door has only just appeared. Sam looked hard in the top right section of the calendar, following Alice's finger. The new door, like the others, was just a couple of centimetres square. He ran his finger over the surface, checking what he thought he saw. It's bars, said Alice, like in a prison. Come in, come on, what's the code? 61:1, called Sam. Alice punched them in. Instantly, a kind of drum roll filled the air, followed by a fanfare of trumpets. Sam took Alice's hand and they faced the calendar. The bars swung open slowly from the centre. Thick grey smoke began to fill the room. But 10 seconds later, nothing else had happened. This is strange, cried Alice. We're not going any... Ow! At that very moment, the floor disappeared. Sam and Alice plummeted through the grey smoke, down, 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 at first through what seemed to be a large black plastic pipe. Then suddenly, the angle began to change and the pipe caught them on huge doormats as it changed from a vertical drop to 80 degrees, then 70, then 60. Holding hands was impossible. Sam was now somewhere ahead of Alice as they plunged downwards, riding the slippery surface of the inside of the pipe. Alice's hair streamed back in the warm wind. Both of them screamed at the top of their voices. Alice saw a sign saying 50 degrees as the descent slowed again slightly. She found she could grip the mat, sit up and look ahead. Sam, she called, it's like a water chute at the pool. Sam was going down feet first on his stomach. He looked up at Alice, stretched out his arms wide and stopped screaming. By the time they passed the sign which said 40 degrees, he'd managed to sit up. The inside of the pipe was polished like a giant slide. Alice found she could swing from side to side. As they hit 40 degrees, there were some sharp bends to the right, then the left, slowing them down a little. Sam found that by gripping the mat and leaning into the bend, he could ride up the side of the pipe, then back down again. The next neon sign said 30 degrees. Alice's hair still streamed back. There was no grey smoke now, just a warm breeze coming from the pipe. Then the pace began to slow until it was 20 degrees, more bends and sharper ones. Before long, it was 10 degrees and a very gentle pace. Finally, at the end of the pipe, it was 0 degrees, and out they shot onto a bed of sand. Both of them tumbled off the mats at Cole's feet. They were in a damp cave, lit only by the burning torch of Cole in Cole's right hand. He motioned to them to speak softly. How was it, he whispered. You're the first to use it. Brilliant, said Alice softly. Best yet. Fantastic, hissed Sam. Once I got the hang of it. Can we have another go, Cole? Cole glowed with pride. I told them it would work, he said, punching one hand in the air. Follow me, no time to lose. Where are we, said Alice, falling in behind Cole as he made his way down a dark passage. The dungeons, said Cole. Keep up. They were in a narrow stone corridor about 2 meters wide. The walls were running with water. The ceiling was low and Sam had to stoop in places. The floor sloped gently upwards. Whose dungeons, Cole? Called Sam, trying to keep up. Ouch! Blistering barnacles. Alice couldn't help grinning as Sam bashed his head for the 3rd time. Cole turned round and signalled again for them to be absolutely silent. He stopped at a sharp bend in the passageway and put out the torch. "We'll stay here for just a moment," he said, very softly. "Let your eyes adjust to the dark." Alice could see nothing at first, but sure enough, after 2 or 3 minutes, she could make out the dark shapes of Cole and Sam and the droplets of water running down the wall nearest her. She shivered, partly with cold and partly with excitement. There was a soft silver light coming from further up the passageway. "Follow me now," Cole whispered. "It's almost time. Stay close." They moved round the bend and down the passage. Alice could see now that just ahead of them, the way was blocked by a grid of metal bars. The silver light was coming from the other side. Cole put his hand into the depths of his robes and pulled out the most enormous bunch of keys. He held them close to his face and selected a small grey key, set it in the lock, and turned it anti-clockwise 3 times. He held the keys in his right hand and turned the iron handle with his left. The heavy door swung open without a sound, and Cole led them inside. Alice and Sam gasped. The dungeon looked like the deepest foundations of a great stone castle. A maze of thick walls and pillars stretched away on 3 sides as far as they could see. The floor was just earth with pools of water here and there. Chained to the walls and pillars by their hands and feet were the prisoners, each out of reach of the others. Each one had a few scraps of dry bread and some stale water, a chamber pot and a rough grey blanket. All looked thin and sick in some way. Most had long hair, some down to their waist. The only way to tell the men from the women were the long beards and moustaches. They were all dressed in rags. Some were held by stocks around their feet, others were steel manacles. Still others were tethered to rings driven into the dungeon walls. Some were sleeping. 1 or 2 pulled at their chains in a half-hearted way, trying to get free. The majority just sat and stared into space. They looked at the 3 visitors, and 1 or 2 stretched out their hands to beg, but with no real hope in their eyes. Alice and Sam had nothing to say, nothing to offer them. Cole led them through the dungeon, stepping carefully between the rows, twisting this way and that in the maze of the foundations. Alice lost count after the first 100 prisoners. They were heading towards the source of the silver light, which spread thinly through the darkness. From time to time, they glimpsed the source, a high window in the far wall. "It's almost time," said Cole at last, stopping underneath the window, which was far above them. 1 minute to midnight. "Here, take this." He took from his belt 2 small glass lanterns and gave 1 to each of them. Alice looked closely. Engraved in each of the 6 panes of glass was a small key. 2 stood open, giving access to the centre. "But there's no wick," she thought aloud. "There's nothing inside the glass at all." "I know," said Cole, still whispering. "Now stand on this precise spot and hold your lantern high. Keep it very still." Sam and Alice did exactly as they were told. They stood a couple of meters back from the window, holding the lantern stretched out towards it with the open panes towards the window. Somewhere in the castle above them, a clock struck midnight. At that very moment, Alice and Sam saw the source of the silver light. A brightly shining star came into view directly overhead, right in the centre of the window, high above them. Alice gasped and turned her head a little away from the light. "Hold still," said Cole. "Keep the lanterns absolutely still." Like Alice, Sam couldn't look directly at the star. Instead, he watched the lantern. Something strange was happening. Instead of spilling evenly into the room, the starlight was being bent and drawn towards the open glass. The star's rays were caught and began to swirl and spin inside. As each lantern caught more and more light, so it began to grow ever so slightly heavier. Hold it still, said Col again. Steady now. He stretched out his own hand and held Alice's wrist, supporting her as the lantern grew heavier. Sam was using both hands now and stood with his feet apart. All the starlight flowing into the dungeon was bending and streaming towards the lanterns. Within each glass, the mist of light was spinning faster and faster, like a tiny hurricane. At the very centre, Alice saw forming a tiny bright spark of silver light, the concentrated fragment of the star's reflection. As more light streamed in, the brighter and larger the centre grew, and the more the weight of the lanterns increased. Col stood between them now, supporting Alice with his left arm and Sam with his right, gazing up at the window. Hold still just a little longer, he said. Alice's arms hurt. She pulled her eyes away from the lantern and looked back at the tiny window. The star was passing now, disappearing on the other side of the frame. A few last strands of light were drawn into the lantern, and then it was gone. Enough, called Col. Lower the lanterns very carefully. As if she held a bowl of molten silver, Alice held her lantern at the top and bottom and lowered her arms to her waist. Col closed the open panes of glass and sealed them with a tiny catch. He did the same with Sam's lantern. Over against the dungeon wall were two long metal poles. Giving one to each of them, Col showed them how to set the pole in the top of the lantern. Lift them high, he said. Don't be afraid. Sam, you go that way to the right, and Alice, you walk to the left. Alice lifted the star lantern high above her head. That part of the dungeon was bathed in a pool of bright white light. There was the sharp sound of metal striking stone. Alice turned her head and gasped. The chains of the nearest prisoner had cracked apart and fallen off. He stood up astounded and stretched his limbs, gazing at the light. It was the same on the other side of the passageway. A pair of manacles holding a woman to the wall were shattered. She hooked her arms to her body, rubbing her wrists. Move forward, Alice, called Col, no longer whispering. You too, Sam. Both of them began a slow procession through the dungeon, taking the light into every nook and cranny. Wherever the light of the star touched chains or manacles, stocks or handcuffs, they were instantly smashed apart. The dungeon was filled with loud cracking, splitting and rending sounds. The prisoners looked on in amazement as they stood and stretched, trying to get the circulation back into their bodies. Sam saw that many of them instantly looked a little stronger. As the lanterns passed them, they began to follow in two slow processions. Some stayed behind. Alice chose her own route through the cavernous dungeon, twisting and turning between the enormous stone pillars, so every part was touched by the starlight from the lantern. As she doubled back, she saw that, whilst all of the prisoners had been set free, not everyone was following the procession. Col was bringing up the rear. He bent to speak to each prisoner who had stayed behind. Some he was able to persuade to get to their feet and join the procession. Some simply stayed where they were, for one reason or another, unable to follow. Despite the joy and wonder of the moment, Alice felt a sharp pang of sadness for each one who chose to stay in that dismal place. On the other side of the dungeon, Sam was also scouring every dark corner for those who were held captive. Col danced ahead now, and then pointing out one place or another which was still hidden. Then as he beckoned to them, Alice and Sam joined their lights together in the centre of the great space. They followed Col as he led them forward, now in as straight a line as they could manage, with the pillars and foundations in the way. Behind them, the two processions became one. The silence of the dungeon was broken by the sounds coming from the crowd. Quiet sobbing, whispering, soft cries of wonder. Cole led them to what seemed to be the main gateway to the prison, an impenetrable wooden portcullis covered in heavy chains and padlocks. The crowd behind them fell silent again. Alice could feel the hope beginning to flow away. Cole turned round to face them. Point the lanterns at the gates, he cried. Use the word of command, Ephphatha. Sam and Alice caught the note of excitement in his voice and lowered their lanterns, pointing them like lances at the bars, chains and padlocks. Ephphatha, they cried together. Ephphatha, called the crowd. There was a loud crack. Something like lightning shot out from the end of each pole. Alice and Sam braced themselves as the poles jumped backwards in recoil. The gates and locks and bolts and chains were reduced to a pile of debris. From behind them came an enormous cheering, which went on for at least 5 minutes. Hope was rising again. Cole led them forward again over the rubble of the gates and down a dark passageway. 50 meters further, there was another door, this one made of steel. Ephphatha, cried Sam and Alice. Ephphatha, thundered the crowd, and it was destroyed. The cheer behind was even stronger. There are 9 gates altogether, cried Cole above the noise as he led them onwards. It seemed to Alice that she was seeing every kind of prison door, every kind of chain, every lock, everything that had ever been used to hold a person captive. Every single one was shattered by the starlight and the word of command. Each shattered barrier brought them closer to the surface. The 9th doorway was an immense stone boulder, rolled against the mouth of the tunnel. Cole stood well back. The lanterns were lowered for a final time. This time, the whole crowd behind them cried in unison 3 times with Cole and Alice and Sam in the lead. Ephphatha, Ephphatha, Ephphatha. The stone was shattered. The cold, fresh air rushed into the dungeon. Sam and Alice led the great crowd of prisoners out into the fresh night air. Instead of armed guards or just emptiness, Alice saw immediately that there was an immense welcoming party in the open air. There were tables piled with food in one direction. There were baths and showers in another. There was a first aid tent. Each prisoner was met with blankets and a warm embrace and taken wherever they wanted to go first. Some chose food and drink, others a medical examination. The majority headed for a bath and new clothes. There was singing and feasting far into the night. Alice and Sam followed Cole round for a while as they supervised all that was happening and stopped for a word, now with a prisoner, now with one of the helpers. From time to time, one of the prisoners would come up to them, tears in his eyes, shake them by the hand and say thank you in a language neither Alice nor Sam could understand. Well done, both of you, Cole said at last, and thank you. Wouldn't have missed it for the world, grinned Alice. Fantastic. Then she yawned. I've kept you out too long, said Cole. Hold hands and hold tight. He reached out his hands and took the lanterns from each of them. As they let go, the scene on the cold hillside quietly faded. Alice felt immediately the warmth of the gas fire in the front room, the carpet, the sofa. She felt suddenly very tired and very hungry. Sam was dozing in the armchair. Megs and Josie came into the room together and switched on the light. Come on, you two. You must be shattered falling asleep in the front room. Sam and Alice both blinked. A 10th door was open in the calendar. Set right in the centre of the open prison bars was a pair of manacles on a stone floor. The manacles were shattered and the prisoner had gone.